First, a disclaimer. If you are a Nazi or a fan of the Nazis, this talk is not for you. The Nazi era was a loathsome abomination and led to horrific atrocities born directly out of Nazi ideas, especially their ideas about race. Before we get into the details of the Nazi vision of race, it's worth noting that pernicious theories about race, and especially racial purity, were not invented by the Nazi Party. Fears of societal decline were widespread in Europe and the Americas in the run-up to World War I and continued in the interwar period, even after the mass die-off of World War I. The nations of Europe embraced a kind of racial vision to rebuild their societies and get them back to their pre-war strength. According to a variety of so-called experts, this would require state intervention to increase birth rates and make sure that the children being born were strong and healthy. To show how widespread loathsome ideas about race were in the interwar period, it's worth looking at what happened in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where laws against race mixing and other attempts to protect the so-called white race against degeneration came into effect in the 1920s. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 in Virginia arose from the assumption that there was a superior race, in this case the white race, and the law was intended to protect that race from degeneration in two ways. The first by preventing race mixing, and the second by cleansing the race of inferior characteristics. The law stipulated that all Virginians at birth had to be declared either white or colored. The one-drop rule meant that any ancestry whatsoever from a non-white meant that one was permanently considered colored, as were all of one's descendants. The law then banned the marriage of whites and coloreds in order to protect the white race. There was also compulsory Sterilization Act passed in 1924, which required that all those deemed, quote, feeble-minded, or people who were habitual criminals, were to be sterilized in the interest of society. The second act was immediately challenged, but it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927. These laws were part of a broader push towards segregation between whites and non-whites throughout the United States, though this push was felt most intensely in the American South. This push arose from pseudoscientific ideas about what race was and what was called racial hygiene. In the absence of a good biological understanding of how genetic inheritance worked, all kinds of crackpot ideas were mainstream. And the most influential ideas were those meant to protect whites from losing their position in a world order in which the empires of European nations and the United States were dominant. So why talk about the Virginia Acts in reference to the Nazis? Well, it's because they were the inspiration for similar acts in Germany implemented by the Third Reich in 1935. Hitler and the Nazis sought to create a racial empire, one based on blood and connection to the fatherland, one which focused on race as destiny. For the Nazis, individuals were nothing. They were part of a race and could only function to aid that race or destroy it. The German race, they thought, had to defend itself against those who would destroy it, and no individual had the right to act against the interests of the race. Humanity was a laughable category for the Nazis. There were only Aryans, usually defined by them as white Europeans, and their inferiors. According to the Nazis, those who were not of the master race were only fit to be enslaved or destroyed by it. So where did this come from, and how did it become so powerful in Germany? Well, defeat in World War I had led to the question of why the Germans, who thought of themselves as a superior race, why the Germans had lost. The racist answer was that the Germans had weakened themselves by interbreeding with inferior races. They had been stabbed in the back by liberals, by Marxists, and above all by internationalist Jews, all groups that wanted to weaken the German race, in theory. In order to bring Germany back to its feet, the Nazis wanted to rid Germany of its internal enemies, make Germany self-sufficient economically, and purify the German race so it could once again assume its theoretical place in the sun. The economic goal was complete self-sufficiency, but Germany didn't produce all it consumed. The answer to the problem for the Nazis, as stated in Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was expansion into the east, taking land in Russia and Poland and converting the surviving people of Slavic descent into slaves to serve the Aryans. In order to restore what they called racial purity, the Nazis adopted laws like those in Virginia, but went much further. They engaged in eugenics on a national scale. They killed or sterilized people they considered undesirable. They had laws regulating who could breed with whom. They racially categorized each individual to guard the Aryan race from decay as they saw it. And this had all happened before World War II started. They also sought to eliminate what they thought of as internal enemies, to purge Germany, at least in public life, if not physically, of all liberals, of all Marxists, and of all Jews. Multi-party electoral democracy was to be destroyed to defend the German race. From 1933 forward, Hitler ruled by decree. All liberal, democratic, and participatory elements of politics, including a constitution or an idea of human rights, were quickly eliminated. From 1929 to 1933, the Nazis ran as an extreme nationalist party in German politics, railing against the Versailles Treaty of 1919, which had dramatically weakened Germany as a world power, and they ran on the platform of anti-Semitism and concepts of racial hygiene. For the Nazis, though, these two things, nationalism and race, were the same issue. When they came to power in 1933, they began implementing their anti-Semitic and racist vision through an anti-liberal politics. In 1935, the Nuremberg decrees, based on Virginia laws from 1924, stripped Jews of citizenship, stripped them of legal protections. In 1938, in November, there is something called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which was a response to an assassination in Paris of a Nazi official. There was a mass wave of state-sponsored looting and destruction in Germany. Thousands of stores owned by Jews and synagogues were destroyed. Hundreds of Jews were wounded or killed, and Jews were collectively fined to pay the expense for cleaning up the mess. By 1939, Jews were being strictly urged to leave Germany. There was a discussion of setting up a reservation in Poland based on the way Native Americans had been placed on reservations in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were displaced after the Nazi conquest of one half of Poland, their land and property given to ethnic Germans being resettled from the Baltic states that the Soviet Union had conquered in a kind of deal with Germany. But by 1941, the entente between the Germans and the Soviets had fallen apart. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invades Soviet Russia, and the problem of what to do with undesirables, such as Jewish people, Soviet political figures, or Russian prisoners of war, became acute. The Nazis decided to handle the large number of Jewish and communist prisoners they had by killing them, out of a fear that these special prisoners, Marxists and Jews, were a particular threat to the German race. Special groups were set up to handle mass executions, initially simply by firing squad. Then, with men, civilian or military, being shot, and women and children being put into the backs of specially built trucks to be killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. It was believed that this was a more humane way to kill women and children than shooting them, but workers still had to confront bodies that had died in horrible ways. Conquest in 1941 quickly outstripped the German ability to kill people, and so a new policy was sought. One worry, actually, was that the brutality of the killing was causing damage to good Germans, who were unable to adequately discriminate between racial enemies and human beings. So, in January of 1942, at a special meeting, Hitler outlined his plan for a final solution to the Jewish problem. Concentration camps would be set up as staging points for mass execution. A new administrative body was set up in Germany to coordinate the mass movements of population necessary, and technical bodies were set up to solve all of the logistical problems involved in moving people long distances in order to exterminate them. By the spring of 1942, death camps were in full swing. They were run by a special division of the German military, the SS, with prison administrators drawn from the ranks of the military, and workers in the prisons, these death camps, drawn from German, Polish, and Russian prisons. Prisoners, murderers, and violent criminals were put in charge of order in the death camps, subject to discipline by the German military. It was a system designed to destroy Germany's racial enemies with the minimum level of harm inflicted on Germans favored by the regime. By 1944, as it became ever clearer that the Germans were going to lose the war, a mass cover-up began, with bodies disinterred and burned, paperwork destroyed. And nevertheless, in the midst of this attempt at a bureaucratic cover-up, mass killings continued until the very end of the war. During the war, the Nazis systematically killed Slavs, Russian prisoners of war, homosexual men, Jehovah's Witnesses and other pacifists, Russian political figures, Polish elites, German dissenters, Roma, civilians or military, anyone determined to be an enemy of the German Reich. But most of all, the Nazis targeted the group of people they claimed, without any good reason, to be the ultimate enemy of the German people, the Jewish people. Around 11 million people were killed in extermination camps, of which between 6 and 7 million were Jews, men, women, and children. All of these killings were entirely unnecessary for the war effort and even hurt German war readiness. These killings were entirely a product of the absurd and loathsome racial visions of the Nazi Party. In World War I, the German people of Jewish descent had fought valiantly for the German Empire. And German men, women, and children had suffered and gone to great efforts to preserve the German Empire. And yet, in World War II, the Nazi state decided they would try to fight all enemies while simultaneously exterminating a large number of their own people. It's simply inconceivable without an understanding of how awful the German conception of race was.